On the morning of March 15, 57 BCE, a 10-year-old girl named Claudia was playing in the sunlit courtyard of her family's Roman villa when the ceremonial horns announced the arrival of death disguised as divinity. The Pontifex Maximus, Rome's highest priest, had come to make his selection. And when his eyes fell upon young Claudia, her mother collapsed in anguish while her father stood frozen, knowing that resistance meant execution for everyone he loved. In that single moment, Claudia's childhood ended, replaced by 3 decades of what the Romans called sacred service, but what history would reveal as something far more sinister. She had just been sentenced to a fate where the punishments for failure were so horrific that scholars still struggle to comprehend how an entire civilization normalized such systematic cruelty against its most vulnerable. The selection of a Vestal Virgin wasn't the honor Roman propaganda claimed it to be. Families across the empire actively hid their daughters when word spread that the Pontifex Maximus was making his rounds. Parents would send girls to distant relatives, fake sudden illnesses, or even temporarily disfigure them with cosmetics to make them unsuitable for selection. The requirements were chillingly specific: between 6 and 10 years old, both parents alive, born of Roman citizens, free from physical defects, and the product of a legally valid marriage. But what the official requirements didn't mention was that this selection process was essentially state-sanctioned kidnapping, blessed by the gods and enforced by the threat of death. When Claudia was taken that day in 57 BCE, she joined a tradition that had already destroyed hundreds of young lives and would continue for centuries more. The transformation began immediately. Her birth name became secondary to her new identity as property of the goddess Vesta. She was escorted to the House of Vestals in the Roman Forum, a building described by ancient writers as the most beautiful prison ever constructed. Behind its marble columns and ornate gardens lay a reality that no amount of luxury could disguise. Claudia would spend the next 30 years under constant surveillance, her every movement monitored, her body no longer her own but belonging entirely to Rome. The 3 sacred laws she learned that first day would govern every moment of her existence: perpetual virginity for 3 decades with no possibility of marriage or physical intimacy, absolute obedience to the Pontifex Maximus and senior religious authorities, constant guardianship of the sacred flame that supposedly kept Rome itself alive. These weren't guidelines. They were laws backed by punishments that made Roman crucifixions look merciful by comparison. Ancient sources describe young Vestals weeping for months after their selection, begging to return home, refusing to eat until forced. But resistance was futile. The goddess had chosen them, and their suffering was reframed as sacred duty. What Claudia couldn't have known in those early days was that her sacred status would unprotect her. It would make her punishments even more brutal. Because she was considered holy, she couldn't be executed like a common criminal when she failed. Instead, Rome had developed specialized methods of torture that preserved her sanctity while systematically destroying her humanity. The psychological conditioning was immediate and complete. She learned that her worth as a person depended entirely on her flawless performance as a Vestal, and any mistake could trigger consequences that would make her long for death, but death wasn't permitted. She was too sacred to kill and too valuable to release. If you're drawn to these forgotten stories of suffering hidden beneath the glory of ancient civilizations, consider subscribing to this channel. Every week we uncover the dark truths that sanitized history books deliberately omit. We are building a community of people who believe that understanding the past, even its most disturbing chapters, helps us recognize when history threatens to repeat itself. Hit that subscribe button and join us as we continue exploring the shadows of human history together. The sacred flame in the Temple of Vesta burned continuously, representing Rome's eternal existence and divine protection. If that flame ever died, it wasn't treated as an accident or natural occurrence. It was prosecuted as treason against the Roman state itself. When the flame went out in the winter of 52 BCE, just 5 years into young Claudia's service, the investigation began with an intensity that revealed the true nature of her captivity. The interrogation lasted for days in a windowless chamber beneath the temple, where Claudia was deprived of food and sleep until she confessed to some failing that might have caused the catastrophe. The punishment that followed was called verberatio, and it took place in absolute darkness in the depths of the temple complex. Claudia was stripped and bound to a wooden frame specifically designed for this ritual. The Pontifex Maximus himself administered the beating using consecrated rods blessed in Vesta's name. But this wasn't random violence. It was carefully orchestrated torture designed to inflict maximum agony while preserving her sacred status. She couldn't be allowed to scream because her voice was holy, so a leather gag muffled her cries. She couldn't be allowed to bleed visibly because her blood was consecrated, so the rods were designed to cause internal bruising and organ damage without breaking skin. Ancient medical texts describe Vestals who died days later from internal injuries, though official records always listed the cause of death as sudden illness or divine displeasure, never punishment-related trauma. The psychological warfare was as devastating as the physical torture. Claudia never knew when the next flame inspection would occur, creating chronic fear that manifested in tremors, hair loss, and rapid aging. Historical records describe Vestals who aged decades in mere months following their first verberatio, but perhaps most insidious was the randomness of it all. The sacred flame could die from causes completely beyond any Vestal's control, a sudden wind, structural problems, or even deliberate sabotage by political enemies. Yet responsibility always fell on the Vestals, and punishment was always inevitable. If ritualized beatings represented Rome's capacity for systematic cruelty, the punishment for incestum revealed something even darker. In 216 BCE, two Vestals named Opimia and Floronia were accused of breaking their vows of chastity based on nothing more than gossip and political rivalry. Their trial was conducted in complete secrecy by the College of Pontiffs. No defense was permitted, no evidence required beyond anonymous accusations. When the verdict was announced, they were told they would be returned to the earth from which all life springs. This poetic language disguised a horror that defied comprehension. The ritual began at dawn with a procession through the Roman Forum. Each condemned Vestal was dressed in a white bridal gown, hair arranged like a new bride, flowers woven into her veil. To uninformed observers, she might have looked like she was going to her wedding. In a sense, she was being married to death. The procession moved slowly, allowing citizens to witness what happened to women who defied sacred law. But the Vestal couldn't speak, cry, or show emotion. Her mouth was sealed with wax to prevent any final words that might create sympathy. The destination was the Campus Saleratus, the field of the wicked, where workers had spent days carving a chamber into the earth. Inside, Rome demonstrated its twisted sense of mercy by providing a bed, a small lamp, a loaf of bread, a jug of water, and a cup of milk. The official justification was that Rome was executing her. They were simply placing her in isolation and allowing the gods to determine her fate. This was legal fiction at its most cruel. The provisions were calculated to last exactly long enough to maximize suffering. The lamp had oil for perhaps 6 hours. The food and water might sustain her for 2 or 3 days. But the air in the sealed chamber would run out long before the food did. The condemned Vestal had to walk down the stairs herself. She couldn't be carried because that would make Rome responsible for her death. She had to participate in her own burial. Once she reached the bottom, the staircase was dismantled, and the opening filled with earth and stones packed so tightly that no sound could escape. Within hours, no visible trace remained except a small, unmarked stone. Ancient sources describe scratching sounds heard from underground in the days following these, Oriel's fingernails clawing at stone walls as the victim tried desperately to escape. But perhaps most devastating was the complete silence that followed. The victim's name was erased from all public records. Her family was forbidden to mourn or speak her name. She didn't just die. She was retroactively removed from existence. For those who survived their 3 decades of service, freedom arrived as the cruelest deception of all. A woman selected at age 8 would be released at 38, past childbearing age and considered unmarriageable in Roman society. The freedom to marry was meaningless when no one wanted to marry you. Romans believed a woman touched by divine forces for 3 decades was fundamentally unsuitable. For normal human relationships, men feared that marrying a former Vestal would bring divine retribution. The case of Claudia Quinta in 43 CE illustrates this reality. After completing her service, she was granted a substantial dowry and introduced to potential husbands. But each engagement was broken when families consulted religious authorities who declared that marrying a former Vestal would pollute their bloodlines. Claudia spent her remaining 20 years living alone, shunned by the society she had served faithfully. She never married, never had children, and died in complete isolation with only hired mourners at her funeral. The psychological damage from 3 decades of institutionalized trauma created additional barriers. Former Vestals suffered from what we would recognize as severe post-traumatic stress disorder. They experienced panic attacks, paranoid episodes, and difficulty forming normal relationships. Historical accounts describe women who woke screaming from nightmares about the sacred flame, who compulsively checked locks on their doors, who couldn't bear human touch. Some attempted suicide rather than face life outside the temple. Others developed what historians called sacred madness, wandering through Rome claiming to receive visions, preaching about divine revelations, performing bizarre rituals in public spaces while authorities ignored them as harmless lunatics. They were casualties of a systematic program designed to control female autonomy through institutionalized terror. By taking girls at their most vulnerable age, isolating them from normal development, and subjecting them to unpredictable cycles of punishment and reward, Rome created a class of women completely dependent on institutional approval for survival. They were fundamental features of how one of history's greatest empires maintained control through fear, all while calling it sacred duty. Leave a comment below and tell me, knowing what you now know about the reality behind Rome's sacred virgins, how does it change the way you view ancient civilizations that we're taught to admire? Sometimes the most horrifying stories are the ones we've been told were honorable all along.